Okay. All right. Haroon, we ready? I think we're ready.
Let's do it.
All right. So, welcome everybody. Haroon, if you want to put on the first slide and share your screen. All right. So, welcome everybody to our webinar today. My name is Roie Schwaber-Cohen. I'm a developer advocate at Pinecone, and with me today is Haroon Choudery, the CEO and co-founder of Autoblocks. And today we'll be talking about getting RAG production ready in regulated industries like healthcare. And I'm going to kick it off to Haroon to talk a little bit about our agenda for today. Go for it, Haroon.
Awesome. Thanks, Roy. So as Roy mentioned, I'm Haroon Choudery. I'm CEO at Autoblocks, and Autoblocks is a testing and evaluation platform. We work with a lot of teams in regulated industries like health tech. Very excited to dig into this. Very quickly, we want to cover a table of contents for the different things that we're going to cover over the next hour or so. So first thing is Roy's going to give us a overview of RAG. What is RAG? How does it work? Then we're going to discuss RAG use cases in healthcare, some of the risks and challenges that are presented due to regulation, techniques for ensuring accuracy and reliability, techniques for managing regulatory compliance concerns. And then we're going to close from there with a demo that Adam, my co-founder and CTO, will be joining for, and we're going to end with some time for Q&A. So with that being said, I'll hand it back over to Roy to start off with an overview of RAG.
Awesome, Haroon. Thank you so much. I'm excited to see the portion of your talk. So we're going to talk about three topics today in my portion. I'm going to give a quick recap on what embeddings are, then explain what a vector database is, and then talk a little bit about RAG, or retrieval augmented generation. These are just like the basic concepts that you'll need to know in order to be able to understand the rest of the demos and the explanations that Haroon and Adam are going to go through. Let's go to the next slide. The basics here, let's talk a little bit about embeddings. Let's go next. Yep. So let's talk about what embeddings are. Essentially, embeddings are the internal representation of a model, of a neural network model. They could be representing all sorts of things, and it depends on what exactly this model is trained on. But the way that you can think of it is these representations help the model understand, quote unquote, the relationships between objects that it's being exposed to, and then represent them in a way that is usable for the model itself and for systems downstream. Basically, the essence of this term embedding means that we're taking those relationships that exist between these objects, and these objects can be things like words or documents or images, and we take those relationships and we represent them in vector space. We're embedding them, essentially. We're taking them from one space and we're embedding them into another space. Let's go to the next slide. If we want to visualize this kind of embedding, we can think of this as a bunch of terms floating in 3D space, right? So embedding space is, in fact, very highly dimensional. So this is a very simplified representation. But in this representation, it kind of gives us an intuition to how embeddings work. And basically what we see here is that terms that have semantic similarity to one another are going to be represented close to one another in the embedding space. And that allows us and the model to sort of discern what's similar to what and what is dissimilar to what. And in that sense, it can understand, quote unquote, the significance of any terms, any specific terms that it encounters. Let's move on. And this understanding is not only limited to specific words, it is also contextualized, meaning that the embedding model is capable of understanding words within a context. So for example, if we have these three sentences in the top that say, where is the Bank of England and where is the grassy bank and how does the plane bank? The embedding for the word bank isn't only just the embedding for the word itself, it's also informed by the context that it is surrounded by. And in this case, because the word is used differently in each one of these sentences, its position in embedding space is going to be farther apart from the others. And conversely, if we have two sentences that are semantically equivalent, right? Even though they're using completely different surface forms, as we have in the last two sentences, which I won't bother reading, their embeddings is going to be closer to one another because they're semantically similar. Okay, let's go to the next one. Now let's talk a little bit about what a vector database is. So a vector database allows us to manage vectors like embeddings, and to do that at scale. And that means that we can do all the things that you would expect a database to do. And that means inserting them or upserting them in Pinecone lingo, deleting them, and querying for them, most importantly. And that's the main job of the vector database. At the end of the day, we want to come to the vector database with an embedding and basically get back similar embeddings to that embedding. And what we can say about those similar embeddings is that they are semantically similar to some extent if they are documents or words, and or sentences, or that they are similar in the sense that they're similar images, right? So I can come in with an image of a cat and expect to get back images of cats as a result if that's my query vector. The last thing that I would say about vector databases that kind of sets them apart from, say, vector indices is that they allow us to associate metadata with each one of our vectors and to make queries against that metadata as well, and not just the vector itself. All right, let's move on. Pinecone is a high-performance vector database. Its main goal is to allow us to manage our data at very high scale. And when I say high scale, I mean billions and hundreds of billions of vectors, while maintaining very, very low latency and optimized performance and cost. This is not trivial to do in a lot of other databases that are out there. You have to sacrifice one or another, but Pinecone itself is one of those solutions that allows you to get that performance gain without having to pay through the nose. And with that, we can roll into what retrieval augmented generation is. So let's go to the next slide. There's this tweet by Andre Karpathy that it's aging pretty well, in my opinion. And the basic premise of it is that people talk about LLMs, which are essentially, you know, they have embeddings in the same way that other embedding models have, and they represent the world through embeddings. But when we query them, we're basically asking them to predict the next token given a token. And you know, there's this conception that sometimes LLMs hallucinate, right? Sometimes they give us answers that are not what we expect. But in fact, and this is what Andre Karpathy is saying, LLMs only hallucinate, right? This mechanic of figuring out what's most likely to come next is the only mechanic that that an LLM knows, and it's actually us that makes the determination, right, of what is considered to be a hallucination and what is not considered to be a hallucination. But the basic mechanic here is always the same. And our goal is to basically make sure that the behavior of the LLM aligns with our expectation. Okay, let's go on to the next one. So how does RAG help with this problem of this misalignment with LLMs? How do we ensure that the LLMs ground their answer in data that we trust? So to start off, LLMs don't know anything about our data. And to make them understand about our data, we have to start thinking about them a little differently. We want to start thinking about them as reasoning engines instead of the source of truth. Instead of going to the LLM and saying, you know, who built the Tower of Pisa, right? We just want to make sure that we provide the LLM with that information and then assume that it is capable of reasoning about that information in a way that will be helpful to the user. So what we do is we take the knowledge base that we have, we essentially embed it, And then I think we can jump on to the next. Oh no, actually, let's stay here. We can take the knowledge that we have, and based on the user's query, we can retrieve the relevant information and inject it into the LLM's context window. Basically, that means we're telling the LLM, look at this information and answer the question that you're going to get based only on this information and not your own information, not only on the trained data that you have, but specifically on the information that I'm giving you here. Okay, let's move on. So in the world of RAG and in the world of this type of application, the questions that a user might ask are probably going to be semantically ambiguous. What does that mean? It means that we can't have an expectation that a user is going to ask a question in a very, very specific way, nor would we want that for our user experience. So in order to bridge that gap and ensure that we understand what the user means to get from our RAG application, what we do is we use embedding models to extract the semantic meaning of the user's prompt. We take our knowledge base as well, we embed it as well and save it in the vector database. And then when we what we do is we retrieve the relevant semantic information based on the user's query, and then we inject it into the context window. And this gives us the opportunity not only to let the LLM respond with data that is grounded in knowledge that we quote unquote blessed, but also be able to say things like, I don't know. Because when we query our vector database with the embedded query, we can basically see whether or not the similarity score for any given result is high enough, right? And is passing a threshold that we set. And if it does not, then basically we can say, hey, the context window here that we're going to inject is empty. And so this application can say, hey, I don't have knowledge about this thing that you just asked, right? And that is a very important capability because that's literally what sets apart an LLM that will choose to hallucinate at that point because it's just going to spit out whatever it's going to spit out, and an LLM that is guided to look at, again, trusted information. Let's move on to the next one. I think that's my one penultimate one. So why shouldn't we just use well, actually, let's move on to the next one. I think we're running out of time for my span here. So the question that we have to contend with, right, is always how do we manage the capabilities of the model with the requirements of our application, right? And this kind of gives us another reason for using RAG in the first place. So in theory, one could say that you could take your entire knowledge base and pass it to the context window, right, and get the RAG application to respond. But in fact, when you pass much smaller pieces of information, we've seen very consistently that the RAG application works a lot better. Again, the mechanism that a vector database gives you in that context is also the ability to provide citation, say I don't know, and these are capabilities that you don't just get when you just plop your entire knowledge base into the context window, right? You want that ability to decide what's in the context window and what is not in the context window. Okay, let's move on. Okay. Just to give a general understanding of how the architecture for RAG applications work, we start with our data source, we move on and chunk our data source into smaller bits, meaning if we have multiple documents, each document is going to be broken down to smaller portions that have some sort of semantic relevance. Each chunk needs to be semantically cohesive so that when we retrieve it later on, it has some sort of semantic significance. We create an embedding for each chunk and associate it with metadata, and then using the API, we upsert it into the vector database. Then on the application side, we go through a very similar process where we take the user's query, we embed it, we add any kind of metadata filter that is relevant for the application at that time. We use the API again to retrieve documents and results from the vector database. We take the query results, we stuff them in the context, and then we send that context back to the LLM to answer the user's question, and then that goes back into the application via a stream for the most part. Let's move on. So when we think about RAG applications, there are multiple considerations that we have to take into account. I'm not going to enumerate them right now. You can definitely ask about them in the Q&A portion. But these are just some of the things that we've seen people kind of grapple with and think about when they're building the RAG applications, starting from how you chunk your data, how do you perform the search in the most optimal way, what are additional ways to retrieve your data other than doing it naively, and then how do you evaluate and monitor your RAG application overall. And this is something that I'm sure will come up in the rest of this talk. But with that, I want to pass it over to Haroon for the next portion. And as I said, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A portion of the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer. So take it away, Haroon.
Thanks so much, Roie. So Roie laid a foundation for what RAG is. Now we're going to discuss what RAG is used for in various industries, especially in health tech. What are some common uses in health tech? We're going to talk about some of the challenges that compliance and regulations present and how you can overcome some of those challenges. So we work with many different types of customers at Autoblocks, and some of the common use cases that we see for RAG systems are in finance, providing personalized financial advice and support, in e-commerce, personalizing product recommendations, and in healthcare, personalizing treatment recommendations and patient care. Ultimately, what these lend to from a business outcomes perspective is improved accuracy, improved customer satisfaction, and improved operational efficiency. Digging specifically into healthcare, some of the specific use cases that we see are patient data summarization. So being able to synthesize large patient records to extract insights. This improves operational efficiency. Personalizing treatment plans, so developing personalized care plans. This improves customer satisfaction. And then clinical decision support, assisting healthcare providers in making decisions by providing them relevant medical literature, guidelines, and patient data. So this lends to improved accuracy. And when you think about LLMs, they're actually quite good at personalizing, but you can't expect an LLM to have access to some very personal data that might be relevant for coming up with things like treatment plans. For example, an LLM has no way of knowing that John Doe is 56 years old, is allergic to X, Y, and Z, and is prescribed to a specific type of medication. But you can leverage RAG to pull in that context to tell an LLM so that the treatment plans are personalized based on some of that context. As I'm sure most of the people on this call know, in industries such as healthcare, you have key regulations to adhere to. And these regulations are there for obviously a very good purpose to protect patient data, maintain public trust, things like HIPAA and GDPR, but they do present some unique challenges and risks for folks that are building RAG applications, since you are pulling in sometimes sensitive data in order to build AI applications. We broadly bucket these challenges and risks into two separate categories. On one hand, you have accuracy and reliability. On the other hand, you have regulatory compliance and data privacy. For the former, it's essentially the goal is to ensure that the outputs you generate are accurate. You're not misleading folks, or you're not giving them the wrong information. A lot of times the risk to presenting the wrong information is very, very high in healthcare. You're dealing with health outcomes, so it's especially serious. And on the regulatory compliance and data privacy side, you want to ensure that you're handling PHI in a very deliberate and careful manner, so that you're not presenting it and creating vulnerabilities that will potentially create some issues for you and your patients down the road. We're going to tackle each one of these two different categories, and we're going to give you tactical tips and techniques for addressing each of these things. First, we're going to start with accuracy and reliability. Again, this is very critical, especially in healthcare. Incorrect data can have serious consequences. And so we have three different techniques that we're going to talk about to ensure that your AI applications, including RAG systems, are accurate and reliable. First, we're going to talk about testing and evaluation. We're going to spend the most time on this because this is, in my opinion, the most important to really get a hold of. Second thing is guardrails and confidence thresholds. And then the third thing is human review. So let's start with testing and evaluation. You may have heard of testing and evaluation before. You may have some of these workflows already that you're using at your company for building whatever AI products that you're building. But let's make sure that we have a shared vocabulary for what exactly evaluators are, because I understand in this space, it can mean many different things. It's a bit of a loaded term. Evaluators or evals are metrics used to assess performance or quality of outputs in LLM apps. It's as simple as that. Examples of these are LLM judges. So these are essentially LLMs that are used to grade the outputs of LLMs, things like correctness scores, accuracy scores, etc. You have rules-based evaluations. These are things that are normally defined in code. They're more deterministic. So things like using regex to check the pattern of outputs or checking for specific characters in outputs. And then the third thing, which really warrants its own section, so we're going to talk about this as a third technique for ensuring accuracy and reliability, is human evaluation. This is very, very important. What are evals used for? They're used for performance measurement. A lot of times when you're building AI applications, the outputs are often subjective. There's no right or wrong answer, so to speak. And there's many different ways to take and represent the quality of those outputs. Evals give you a metric that you can measure and improve. Because as we know, what gets measured gets managed. And so evals let us apply some of that methodology to building AI systems, including RAG systems. Quality assurance, so making sure that your the output quality is high, and then that you're ensuring compliance and safety. Testing and evaluation can help with all three of these things. How do you use evals? So essentially, evals are used to assess the performance of outputs. The way that you use evals is that you have test cases, and these test cases essentially represent different inputs to parts of your RAG system or entire AI product pipeline. You pass those test cases through a specific part of your application, and then you generate an output. And then evals run on that output to give you a scalable and measurable way of evaluating your output. At Autoblocks, we recommend testing and evaluating the retrieval and the generation portion separately. For most intents and purposes, you can essentially test and evaluate these things in a fairly mutually exclusive way. We suggest starting by doing it separately, and then you can run a end-to-end test once you're happy with the optimizations you've made to both parts of the system. So this is the same diagram that Roie shared earlier that represents a RAG application. We just color-coded a couple of things here. One is where the retrieval portion takes place, and then where the generation portion takes place. So the retrieval portion is really centered around, between the query to the vector database and where the context is pulled in. And then the generation is when you take the context, you add it to a prompt template, and then you pass it into an LLM. So you're testing two different parts of the system here. And the retrieval portion, you can actually expand it to any part. Even before that, you can actually experiment and test with different embedding models, different metadata filters, vector embeddings. But for simplicity's sake, we're going to say that retrieval is simply the retrieval part of taking some data from a vector database, querying it, and pulling it in as context. So let's discuss the retrieval portion and how you test and evaluate it. The main question you're trying to answer when you're evaluating the retrieval stage is the retriever pulling in the most relevant information to address the user's query or request? That's the bottom line. That's what you're trying to solve for here. So what you're comparing is the retrieved data to the input. And you want to make sure that the retrieved data is the most helpful context based on the input that was entered. Some of the things that you might tweak are the similarity metric, the number of documents retrieved, and the query to the vector database. Some of the metrics that you might use in order to figure out how well this part of the system is working is relevance. How relevant is the retrieved chunk compared to the input? and then some traditional scores that you might find in ML ops tooling like precision, recall, F1 score. In other words, you can even think about it from the context of um, sensitivity and sensitivity representing precision. So there's other words to represent it, but you can use some of these different metrics. The ideal data set for evaluating the retrieval side is you have a data set that has sample inputs into the retrieval system and then retrieved chunks from the vector database. You can actually generate this test set synthetically, and there are some great libraries for helping out with this, such as Ragas, and we have some internal, we have some tooling at Autoblocks to help you with this as well, where you can almost reverse engineer this. You take different chunks of data from your vector database, and then you can generate sample inputs based on each of those chunks. So what you end up with is a data set that quote unquote is a ground truth for inputs and the correct chunks to retrieve based on those inputs. So this way you create a very tight feedback loop. The next portion here is evaluating generation. The main question you're trying to answer is the generated LLM output correct? So what you're comparing is the input to the LLM and the retrieved context, both to the outputs. You want to make sure that the LLM is set up for success. It has all the context that it needs to be able to answer a specific question, and that it's not hallucinating and making things up. Some of the things that you might be tweaking are prompts and the model, and also various parameters within a model. For example, temperature is one common one that folks will adjust. Some of the metrics that you might use here, you might use LLM judges like relevancy, faithfulness, and correctness to take the output and compare it to the retrieved context to essentially ensure that the LLM isn't making anything up and the output represents the information that the LLM was provided during the retrieval phase. One of the tips here is that because the output from the generation stage is usually human readable, this is where we think a manual review process is especially helpful, where you can have subject matter experts validate the output. This will help you ensure the accurate and reliable results. And also, there are ways that you can take some of that expertise and actually improve the overall system, which we'll discuss in a little bit more detail. Okay, so that's testing and evaluation. Let's talk very quickly about guardrails and confidence thresholds. So these are ways that you can mitigate risks systematically. Guardrails, you can almost think about them as evaluations that you run before you generate an output for a user, before you send the output or serve it to that user. And guardrails will essentially look at an output, and if it meets a certain criterion, you can decide whether that output gets sent to a user or whether it doesn't. You can use confidence thresholds as well, as Roie had mentioned earlier, to help the guardrails understand your risk threshold. And for example, you can say if the semantic similarity is below a certain threshold, you do not want to send the output over to the user because we're not very confident in its in the context that was generated or the output that was generated. And we highly recommend having some continuous monitoring in place so that you can catch some of these issues before they actually become even bigger issues by giving your users bad information or even worse, potentially harmful information. The third category here is human review. And as I mentioned, this category really deserves its own section. As much as we like to say that the entire process of testing and evaluation is very flywheel and automated at this point, the truth of the matter is we talk to hundreds of AI product teams, some of the best AI product teams in the world, and human review is a very essential part to all of their testing and evaluation processes. It's instrumental for taking subject matter experts and making sure that they're able to validate not only the outputs, but also the evaluation results. You can leverage this expertise to further improve your LLM app pipeline. You can use some of the data from these subject matter experts to fine-tune models. You can actually take those expert preferences and you can align LLM judges, or in other words, improve the ability of these LLM judges to make automated decisions by basing them and grounding them in expert preferences. You can use label data for few-shot prompting. We don't really recommend this. It doesn't work that well, but it's something you can do. You can do RLHF, reinforcement learning with human feedback, more advanced technique, but something that works quite well. And you can also just use some of the subjective qualities of the feedback that the subject matter experts provide by reviewing outputs manually to drive improvements. For example, if a bunch of your SMEs are telling you that the outputs are aggressive, as a simple example, then you could probably take that feedback and apply it pretty quickly to the prompt or guardrails to ensure that you have the right mechanisms in place to prevent that. All right, so we discussed techniques for improving accuracy and reliability. Next, we're going to quickly touch on techniques for managing regulatory compliance concerns. For example, avoiding leaking sensitive data. There's a few techniques that you can instill that we recommend if you want to prevent sensitive patient data from being leaked. One is anonymization, so you can anonymize that data completely. Setting access controls. So if you have authorized personnel and unauthorized personnel, you can essentially set those controls in place so that the right people are able to see the right amounts of data or granularity of data. And then just general security measures like regular security audits and vulnerability assessments to mitigate risks. On the note of anonymization, it's worth pointing out some of the pros and cons with anonymization and pseudo-anonymization. Pseudo-anonymization is similar to anonymization in that you're taking sensitive data and you're representing it in a different way. But in essence, anonymization is a blunt axe where you're taking sensitive data and you're obfuscating it or you're modifying it completely, and you don't care so much about keeping some of those relationships between that data as it's represented in other data sets in place. Pseudo-anonymization preserves data relationships. And so what this lends to is generally better accuracy for the purposes of testing and evaluation. You have the same relationships in place, but you don't have sensitive data because that data is represented in a different way. The risk to pseudo-anonymization is that if somebody finds your pseudo-anonymization key, then they could essentially backtrack to your original data, which is obviously not good. So it's a higher risk if that pseudo-anonymization key is somehow compromised, but it does ensure more accurate and realistic testing. Or you can use HIPAA-compliant vendors. We have plenty of companies that are using Autoblocks, and their users are essentially working with sensitive data in Autoblocks because we're HIPAA-compliant, so is Pinecone. And so even if you're dealing with anonymization, pseudo-anonymization, you've incorporated those techniques into your workflow. With HIPAA-compliant vendors, you can ensure that you have comprehensive compliance. And even in the case of PHI exposure that was unintentional, you have coverage. You also can mitigate the risk of data breaches, ensure data integrity across your entire system, and just build stakeholder confidence in your AI system safety and reliability. Because as we know, some of these risks and concerns can really be blockers in regards to innovating in an industry. So these are things that you want to make sure that you have peace of mind on so that you can really go ahead and leverage AI to its fullest potential. So as I mentioned, Pinecone, Autoblocks, both HIPAA-compliant vendors, and both tools that are used to build reliable and trustworthy healthcare applications. We'd love to connect. So here is our information. Please take a screenshot, or we'll send out some of this information afterwards as well. But you can reach us via email, LinkedIn, and also link to our Twitter profiles or X profiles or whatever it's called nowadays here as well. And finally, we're going to end with a demo. So I'm going to hand it off to my co-founder and CTO at Autoblocks, Adam Nolte, to walk you through a healthcare co-pilot for generating a clinician plan based on the patient-clinician transcript. And just to kind of give you a high level of what this demo is going to look like, we're going to take a transcript We're going to generate a plan. So if you think about a SOAP note, we're only taking care of the last part, the P, the plan, generating a plan based on transcript. Oh, sorry. And this transcript is from a patient-physician interaction. We're going to retrieve relevant medical records based on that specific plan and the patient. We're going to generate a personalized plan based on some of that additional context. And then we're going to output the personalized plan to the user. And there's a couple of tests that we're going to run here. One is going to be for the retrieval side. We're going to test that the right chunks are being retrieved. And then on the generation side, we're going to test the correctness of the generated outputs from the LLM to make sure that that everything is set there. And very quickly, before I hand it off to Adam, did want to mention we have a health tech partner program. So we're working with about 10 healthcare companies we're going to work with them very closely on implementing Autoblocks, evaluation consultation, industry roundtables and co-marketing with leaders in the healthcare space. And also you get roadmap prioritization for some any feature requests that come up during the POC period. So we have 3 spots remaining. If you're interested, autoblocks.ai/health. There's a QR code here as well, and applications will close by end of week. So definitely reach out to us and the Pinecone team if you're interested. And I'm going to hand it off to Adam to do the demo.
Thanks, Haroon. Hey, everyone. I'm Adam, CTO at Autoblocks. Great to meet you all. I'm going to walk through a demo, the demo app that Haroon talked about, where we're using Pinecone and Autoblocks together to build a RAG application. To start, I'm here on my Pinecone dashboard, where I have a handful of indexes set up with a few different similarity metrics and configuration. And you'll see in Autoblocks how I'm able to easily test between the different indexes and understand which works best for my specific use case. Looking at the indexes, you'll also notice that I'm using namespaces to keep patient data separate to avoid leaking data across different patients, ensuring compliance there. Now I'm going to jump into my Autoblocks dashboard and take a look at my test suites here. So Haroon mentioned that we have a few different tests set up. I have my end-to-end test where I'm testing the entire Copilot here, as well as my generation and retrieval tests. So like mentioned earlier in the presentation, we really recommend you test each of these portions in isolation so you can get really fine-grained controls and understanding, as well as set up some end-to-end tests to test the entire thing together. On my dashboard here, I'm able to check trends across my evaluators here for comprehensiveness, faithfulness for my generation, relevancy, how relevant are the chunks that I'm retrieving. I can also look at other metrics such as duration. How long are things taken? This can be really important in applications where latency is really, really important. And like Roie mentioned earlier, when you use a vector database like Pinecone that's really performant, this can make a big difference in the entire test. Now we'll take a look at my retrieval test specifically. So I've generated some test cases here based on a set of medical records. So I created a set of inputs for this test. I have a set of, I know what chunks generated that, what I should be retrieving. And I'm able to see the relevancy score here of how well this is performing. I can also, inside of Autoblocks, open up the product playground here, where I can see the configuration that I'm using. So for example, top K, how many documents am I retrieving? I can tweak that and understand inside of Autoblocks how relevant all of the documents are. There's a threshold where, hey, when I return more than 5, things start to drop off, as well as similarity metric. So this is where I can configure, which index, what the configuration in Pinecone that I want to use for my test, easily switch between these two, and then rerun my test right here. Autoblocks integrates with your CI provider so that you're always running the tests through your code base and through your actual pipeline to ensure the tests are as an accurate representation of your app. Now we'll go back and take a look at the generation test. So once we're confident in retrieval and we want to take a look at the actual generation portion, I can do that here as well. And I'm able to see my 2 evaluators, comprehensiveness and faithfulness here. at the top. And now on the generation test, what I'm going to tweak if I jump into the playground is going to be the prompt as well as the parameters to the model. So here again, just like in the retrieval test, I'm able to select, different models. I can select different parameters, adjust those here, as well as adjust the prompt templates and then rerun this. Again, this is going to rerun, through your actual code base. You can get a real understanding of how your application performs based on changes you're making right here. And it's all tracked inside of one UI here in Autoblocks. Now that I'm confident in my automatic evaluators, so if I think these are good, before I go to production, like Haroon mentioned, an important part, especially in these sensitive industries like healthcare, is you likely want to have a human in the loop that might be a subject matter expert, like a physician, a nurse, or a doctor. So I can launch a human review session right here for my test page. I'm going to be entered into this view where I can easily see what the input was for the test. So what medical records are feeding into this, what was the existing treatment plan, and what was the personalized treatment plan. Now I've set up a rubric of scores for myself. I could send this off to that subject matter expert so they can go through and they can grade all of my results here based on what they're seeing. They can also leave comments directly on here. For example, say, hey, this was a hallucination. This was never mentioned in the record. So all of this data that you can collect through human review is really great. Like Haroon mentioned, when you get into more advanced techniques like RLHF for building fine-tuned automatic evaluators. So this is a great source of knowledge to be able to do all of this, automatically and continue to be confident in what you're shipping to production. Speaking of production, once I've deployed to production, I can head over to my production dashboard here, where I've also set up some guardrails and evaluators in production. So I have that same faithfulness evaluator where I'm using an LLM-based judge to check, hey, was the output correct based on the context that we have for our system? And what's really important to track this so you can get an understanding of, hey, where things might be failing. Because even if you do everything right in testing, new use cases might pop up that you don't expect, and you want to be able to debug and improve those. So since I'm collecting all of this inside of Autoblocks and using a HIPAA compliant platform, I can actually generate test cases based on all of these failure modes. So jumping in here, I can add test cases to my generation tests. I can set up my mapping of the production data to my test cases, and then click generate to go ahead and pull all of those in. And now I'll have a set of test cases. I can select which ones, modify them, and add them to my test suite. This really helps you to ensure that you're always incorporating, hey, what's happening in production, new use cases, new failure modes, make sure that your test suite is comprehensive. Just to kind of quickly recap what we talked about is we set up a few Pinecone indexes. We're able to test our application, test different configurations in Pinecone using Autoblocks, incorporate human review before we go to production to ensure that we're always shipping confidently. And then in production, use guardrails and monitoring to watch out for those edge cases or the new use cases that might pop up and add them to our test suite to continue iterating. Everything that I walked through today is available in the Autoblocks examples repository, as well as the scripts to set up the Pinecone indexes, the sample data, and the prompts that were used. So feel free to go over and check that out. And now I'm going to hand it back off to Roie for Q&A.
Thanks so much, Adam.
Okay. Haroon, do you want to read off some of the questions? I'll read the questions and maybe you can try and tackle them. Is that so good?
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds great.
Okay. So we'll start with the first one from Sunil. Do you see a role for healthcare terminology like SNOMED in RAG to get better semantic search results since they already have the interrelationships defined?
Yeah, great question, Sunil. And I candidly had to Google what SNOMED is, but just for everyone on the call, it stands for Systematized Nomenclature of Medicine Clinical Terms. And so it provides a comprehensive ontology interrelationships between medical terms. So something like this, an ontology that provides essentially an understanding of relationships between different medical terms would definitely be very valuable for a RAG system. I would say it would be most valuable if you're able to embed some of that data into the vector database so that some of those relationships are captured in a tool like Pinecone. Because it just makes the entire job of essentially finding the most similar chunks of data much more easy if some of those features are represented in those embeddings. So definitely something that is worthwhile and also worth testing. I would reckon that it would improve the accuracy of your applications. Roy, curious if you have any thoughts about that. Is that where you would recommend leveraging
Yeah,
something like
I
an
actually,
ontology?
it's interesting because ontologies and generally speaking, any kind of graph structure that you may have probably should live in a graph database. Like the mantra that we always use for explaining when to use our database versus others is you want to use the right tool for the job, and there are many ways of interrelating these two tools. So, for example, if you have the terminology that lives inside of your ontology, say SNOMED, right? The question you have to ask yourself is how is the user going to interact with this ontology, right? And then how is the application going to interact with this ontology? So as we mentioned in the opening segment about RAG, the user is going to probably ask a semantically ambiguous question, right? You're probably, and that's what you should expect most inputs into a RAG system to be, right? Semantically ambiguous. What does that mean? That means that like you should have somewhere in your vector database the representation of the things that you care about. In this case, maybe this is SNOMED, right? You should have that there as an embedding, right? An embedded representation saved in the vector database. But what you can do with a vector database that you can't just do with, say, a graph database is you can associate that embedding with, say, a node that lives in a graph database. So now, okay, you've established that you have like this incoming vector, right, which is an embedding, right? So again, semantically ambiguous query that matches up to a node on a graph database. And now you can start asking a question of the graph database, right, in the way that you're used to. So if you already know how you interact with your ontology, you can continue doing so, but your entry point has been made clear, right? And we've seen this kind of interplay between graph databases and vector databases, where again, the goal of the vector database is to bridge the gap between the semantically ambiguous and the structured. And then the graph databases or the relational databases job is to provide, again, the same kind of reasoning that you are used to doing from classical software engineering, and bring it into the fold, right? And that's mostly how I see the interplay between the two. Cool. I guess we can move on to the next question. Let's see, we have quite a lot of them. So an anonymous attendee asks, will the provider be required to train the model, or will it be managed by Autoblocks? Sorry.
Yeah, Adam, do you want to take a stab at this one? And maybe we could tackle that one. And then there's also a related one where Didier asked where Autoblocks is running. So maybe we could tackle both of those.
Yeah, I think there's a couple questions around the LLM model, and yeah, the model used by Autoblocks. So the beauty of the way that Autoblocks works is that you own the code and it calls out to the models. So you're able to use your own fine-tuned models, custom models, your vector databases in Pinecone, and then you use the Autoblocks SDK to set up the functions and the parts of your app that you want to test and expose the configuration to Autoblocks. So Autoblocks doesn't actually make the calls to the models for you. We just integrate with your CI provider. So we run them on your infrastructure. You make the calls, you own that portion of your application.
Cool. Okay, the next one. Um, Most of the healthcare providers are IT agnostic. How would they manage the application with so much of config needed for the best output? Does that track with either of you?
I'm not sure I fully understand this question. So, whoever the anonymous attendee is, feel free to clarify. We would love to have a little bit more context. No pun intended on what this question entails. I'll take a stab at it based on my understanding of the question. So it seems like the question is that healthcare providers may not have the control over some of those configs that are required for ensuring the best output. And I think the simple answer to that is that you do need controls into things like the prompt, the model, the retrieval system in order to shape the outputs. So that's a bit of a prerequisite. I would say I would be surprised if a product team that's specifically focusing on improving the outputs from these AI applications that are being built internally doesn't have control into that. But maybe I'm misunderstanding the question. So yeah, anonymous, definitely feel free to add more context if I misread the question. But that's my best shot at that one. So I see a question here about, can you use the OpenAI API in healthcare? If so, what is the best way to utilize your models in the space? You definitely can use the OpenAI API in healthcare. I believe OpenAI has the option for you to assign a BAA, so that you can ensure the data that's being sent is going to be used for training purposes and that it can adhere to guidelines like HIPAA. So you definitely can use it even if you want to work with sensitive data. And you also have the option of anonymizing or pseudonymizing your data before sending it into a open cloud provider like OpenAI as well. So we see it quite commonly. Definitely not a blocker, just some additional considerations there.
Really good question that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on. When should a company think about using testing and evaluation of a solution during development or post prod? So when's the best time to think about these things?
Great question. We think it's best to do it. So you can do it in either case, but we recommend doing it before you go live and deploy your application into production. This way, you're able to catch issues that may become bigger issues before you actually deploy into production. And it's actually quite feasible to do testing and evaluation during the prototyping phase. I would say the biggest challenge to it is that you may not have the most accurate representations of test cases or sample inputs that might go into your application. So that's where you might have to use your creativity a little bit. But for the most part, you can take a few examples of inputs that you expect. You can proliferate them. We actually have great tooling for that in Autoblocks to help you multiply some of those test cases so that you can get as much coverage as possible. You won't really know what the edge cases are, or you might get some weird inputs down the road once you deploy into production, but there's no reason not to do it before you deploy into production. So short answer is we highly recommend doing it locally, and then once you go live, leveraging some of the inputs that you're seeing to continually expand your test cases so that you get complete coverage over the possible inputs that your application may receive.
Awesome answer. Someone had the question, and this is also something that I'm curious about. How is the data set used for the evaluation created in the first place?
Yeah, Adam, do you want to take this one based on the demo application, how you generated the data sets for that?
Yeah. So for the demo that we walked through, one common technique is if you do have, I had a sample set of anonymized medical records, and then essentially using a LLM to generate questions. So inputs into that, we were doing transcripts, so generated sample transcripts from there, and that can get you a good a good base, just based on the data that you already have. You can also think about, like Haroon mentioned, depending on your use case, think about like question and answer, think up some questions. But in that same world too, you can generate questions essentially from the ground truth or the data that you have using an LLM to get a fairly representative set that you have.
Cool. One more. I think we have time for one more. Question one, where is Autoblocks running? In a private cloud? This person says that they're in a GCP shop and they want to know how that would work. And then the second question is, are you dependent in terms of the database? So can you only use Pinecone or can you use other vector databases? And a third question is, does it make sense to use graph knowledge going forward or just the vector database?
Yeah, I can take this one. So Autoblocks has two offerings. So we run on a private cloud on AWS as our SaaS offering. We also offer self hosted options if that's a requirement for your use case. We find that most folks with our strong compliance posture, tend to use the cloud offering as well, so they don't have to worry about the security and running all of that. But we do have multiple options there. And then you are able to use kind of similar to what I was talking about with the models. So you can use whatever vector database. We recommend. Pinecone works really well. But you have full control over your data, your application when using Autoblocks. And then, for the last question, it's a bit hard to know without understanding the full use case. So it's probably, use case dependent, testing and evaluating, understanding, what makes sense for your specific use case.
Okay, we'll take one last question. This kind of half a question for us and half a question for you guys. When creating the vector database data, how much time is reasonable to spend evaluating embedding models? And can the eval of the embeddings be automated in Autoblocks? So I'll give you my 2 cents. Among the state-of-the-art models, the differences in retrieval performance is relatively negligible. And for that matter, it's probably not something you're going to spend like an enormous amount of time. The real differences start when you're looking at open source models, say, that kind of diverge from the state of the art, in which case you'd have to play around with them, and on fine-tuned embedding models that obviously may perform well in certain cases and less in others. And I think that, because it's sort of like the linchpin of the entire operation, right? So you're creating your embeddings for the knowledge base, you're creating the embeddings for the query. In both cases, it's kind of important that the semantic representation is preserved. It's probably something you want to spend a good amount of time on if you're not using the state of the art, right? So if you're using the state of the art, then you're probably good to go. And otherwise, you probably want to spend a good amount of time testing and ensuring that you get good performance. I think that the best way to do something like that is using like a tool like Autoblocks. And I'll let you guys answer whether or not there's a way to automate this process with Autoblocks.
Yeah. So like I kind of showed in the demo how you can expose the configuration. That makes it really easy if you wanted to swap out different embeddings models. You could set that up for your own fine-tuned embeddings models. That's something we see as well when you start getting more advanced. So like Roie mentioned, the state-of-the-art ones, do quite well, and then you can get more advanced. But yeah, when you're using a tool like Autoblocks, it makes it easy to compare which ones are working better as well.
Cool. I think this is all the time we have for today. This has been a really cool and interesting and a very informative webinar. I certainly learned a lot. Haroon, Adam, thank you so much for coming and joining us today. It's been really a lot of fun to learn about Autoblocks and to work with you guys. And again, all of this material is going to be available after this webinar concludes. So we'll have the the video up on YouTube, sorry, and we'll have all the code shared. So yeah, reach out to us if you want to ask follow-up questions. But for now, we'll say goodbye. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone.